Yesterday, Julian Castro officially ended his bid for the presidency. And for a change, my video will be timely. I will be making content about a candidate who ended his campaign within 24 hours of that event. How exciting is that? Yesterday, I released a video on Jay Inslee, who dropped out back in August. So by contrast, my timing in this instance is impeccable. Let's get to Julian Castro and his 2020 campaign. As always, I'll be looking at Castro's entire political career and also looking at his campaign and where it went wrong. I've seen a lot of political obituaries really mourning the death of the Castro campaign, talking about how much he brought to the race, how important he was, how great he is, etc., etc. I have to say I don't really agree with that at all. Castro does bring up some good issues on occasion, but for the most part, Castro is, as I'll show, just another neoliberal who is a product of a party which has become obsessed with identity politics. I heard Emma Vigeland on TYT say that Castro deserves so much better from the Democratic Party and that they need to restructure the primary process to help out minority candidates, that Iowa and New Hampshire, which are overwhelmingly white, should not come so early and hurt someone like a Castro. I sort of agree with the sentiment. The problem is I don't care what order the states are in. Julian Castro had no chance of winning the 2020 Democratic nomination. The reason is Castro is hard to pin down ideologically. Now, I think I've done it, and I'll get into that in this video. I think I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that his commitments are fundamentally neoliberal. And I also will contend in this video that despite Castro having more upsides as a potential president than a whole lot of the candidates in the field, the fact of the matter is that this guy is really hard to elect because he lacks some of the essential ingredients that a successful candidate needs. Without any further ado, let's look at Julian Castro, his entire life, political career, and his failed 2020 bid. If we had to pick just one issue that Julian Castro is known for, it would without a doubt be immigration and the various issues that arise from immigration. It should come as no surprise that that's the case when you look at Julian Castro's family background. Castro's grandmother immigrated to Texas from Mexico in 1920 as a 6-year-old orphan, joining family members who were already living in the U.S. That's a pretty harrowing tale, and of course Castro's grandmother then grew up, met his grandfather, and gave birth to Castro's mother. Castro's father was a Hispanic man who taught math and was also a political activist. His parents weren't married, and I couldn't really find much other information on his father, but I'm sure that his father helped to shape Castro's worldview and to inspire him to be interested in politics. It's very clear, however, that the most influential parent on both Julian and Joaquin Castro was their mother, Rosie Castro, who was a fairly well-known Chicana activist who has involvement with the Democratic Party dating back to LBJ's 1964 campaign. Rosie was fairly well connected in the San Antonio community, apparently, and this really seems to be the inspiration for the political aspirations of both of the Castro brothers. Julian and his twin brother Joaquin were born in 1974, with Julian being 1 minute older than his identical twin brother. Julian Castro attended school in San Antonio. When he was in high school, he played tennis, football, and basketball. Along with his twin brother Joaquin, Julian attended Stanford University, gaining admittance due to affirmative action. Throughout his adult life, due to his own experiences at Stanford and later at Harvard, Castro has held up affirmative action as something that very much works and that he claims to be efficacious. So when he speaks on that issue, he's speaking from personal experience, and it is a much more compelling case than a lot of people who speak about it who have never had anything to do with it. That being said, of course, affirmative action is not the most popular policy, and it can be quite a hard sell for most people. In 1996, Castro graduated from Stanford with a BA in Political Science and Communication. Apparently, both he and his brother had somewhat mediocre SAT scores, but they did just fine in college. There were people who knew both of them in college and said that the two of them are quite a bit alike, but with one key difference. Julian is much more bookish and reserved, whereas Joaquin is something more of a party guy, some more life of the party. They are pretty hard to tell apart, if not impossible, and on at least one occasion in high school they supposedly switched clothes and one attended the class of the other. During one summer, Julian interned in the Clinton White House while he was in college. The two brothers ran for the Stanford Student Senate, and both of them tied for being the top vote getter, so both of them ended up in the Student Senate. Later on, the two brothers went to Harvard Law in 1997, and they graduated in 2000 with their law degrees. The two of them then returned to San Antonio. From the very time that they left Harvard and returned to San Antonio, it is very clear that both Julian and Joaquin had high political aspirations. The two of them were able to secure work at the law firm of Aiken Gump. This is a DC-based firm that has branch offices throughout the country. This law firm is mostly known for its work lobbying and is extraordinarily well connected with all of the powers that be in the American political scene. The two brothers went on to found their own law firm in 2005, following a painful defeat for Julian. While they were working at Aiken Gump, Julian was successfully elected to the San Antonio City Council in 2001. Going into the 2005 mayoral race, Julian was considered to be a front-runner, but narrowly lost in a runoff election. The only thing I could find about his time during the city council was that he fought against putting in a PGA golf course, which presumably would have driven poorer residents on the fringe of the city out of their home. The district that he represented as a city councilor was older and more Hispanic than most of San Antonio. After dealing with that 2005 defeat, Julian Castro apparently attributed this outcome to the efforts of the opposing campaign manager. So when he decided to run for mayor again in 2009, he hired the campaign manager who had overseen his defeat 4 years earlier, and he then went on to be successfully elected to the office of mayor 3 times in 2009, 2011, and 2013. One might think that being the mayor of the 7th largest city in America would be a pretty good jumping off point for a political career. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that San Antonio has a city manager who has almost all of the actual power, so the office of mayor is more or less an honorary position. Much the same can be said of Wayne Messam in Miramar, Florida. However, Castro did manage to achieve a couple of minor things while he was mayor in San Antonio. In 2010, he founded an organization called SA 2020, which became a nonprofit group dedicated to helping San Antonio achieve its goals by 2020. The challenge was to envision how people wanted the city to be in 10 years, and then this organization would help to make sure that became a reality. It's not very clear if this organization actually achieved all that much, but given the very limited powers of the mayor's office, I guess this is about as much as he could have done. One thing he did do that was a little more substantive, also in 2010, was to start an organization called Cafe College. This is a service which gives free advice to graduating high school students on how to attend and pay for college. It's probably a pretty good service, and certainly a pretty solid achievement for a mayor who doesn't have much actual power. One thing Castro also did as mayor was to promote universal pre-K for all residents of San Antonio. He worked with 2 local prominent business leaders to institute a $30 million sales tax in order to fund this pre-K initiative. Of course, sales taxes are fairly regressive, so this was possibly not all that well received, although pre-K is something that a lot of people can get behind, so it's a good thing, but the way that he pays for it is hardly progressive. By 2010, Castro had come to be seen as a rising star in the party, and there were articles written about him in Time and other publications. And apparently Obama got wind of this, and he was looking for some more future stars to put in his administration. So he offered him the post of Secretary of Transportation in 2012, but Castro declined because he wanted to remain in Texas. At the time, he was thinking of running for governor in 2017. That, of course, never ended up happening. But the point is that without actually doing anything other than being elected mayor, Julian Castro became singled out as a rising star and someone who was destined for greatness. This is very literally political affirmative action. While he rebuffed Obama's initial offer of a cabinet post, when Obama came knocking again in 2014, Castro decided to leave San Antonio for D.C. in order to become the head of Housing and Urban Development. Castro inherited a department which had a fundamentally backward policy that was harming homeowners. What HUD was doing at the time was to minimize its own losses and expenditures by taking on failed mortgages and then selling them off as quickly as possible to Wall Street firms in a way that was harmful to homeowners. Homeowners then had to negotiate with Wall Street firms which were only interested in making a profit and had no interest in helping them retain their home ownership. Most of the people who went into this program ended up losing their homes. This was, of course, the long-term fallout of the housing crisis of 2008. However, this policy turned out great for large Wall Street firms such as Blackstone, which made all kinds of money off of this deal. They would buy things off the government pretty cheap and then resell it to the homeowners or to other buyers at a much higher price. Now, there was a marked reduction in the number of sales by HUD to Wall Street firms between 2014, when Castro took over, and 2015, the first full year of Julian Castro at the helm, but most likely this was due to there being a smaller backlog of cases since the housing crisis had happened some years before, and by that time the housing market had largely stabilized. Castro did not change this abominable policy for several years. It took about 2+ years of nonstop pressure from progressive activists, and it was only in May of 2016, when Castro had finally set his sights on being Hillary's VP, that he decided to take action and end this program. There are activists who defend Castro's conduct and say that while his conduct wasn't perfect, he did what he could, and that he had to convince Obama to lift this policy. Other activists think that Castro was culpable all along, and that he was more than happy to be an errand boy for Wall Street. At any rate, I think that it is far too coincidental that Castro decided to do the right thing when it was politically convenient, and it is very clear to me that Castro did not take seriously the needs of homeowners until he started to think of those homeowners and the activists pressuring him as potential supporters. When he was appointed to be HUD Secretary in 2014, this further elevated Castro's stock, and it made him seem like a political rock star. Before this, his biggest achievement, other than being mayor of San Antonio, had been to deliver an address at the DNC back in 2012. So now, Castro's stock was so high that he was being considered as a potential VP pick for Hillary. The party as a whole had already decided that Hillary was going to be the nominee, and at this point they thought the only competition would be for the bottom slot on the ticket. Castro caught wind of this, and he was interested in advancing once again by not having to do anything. So Castro predictably endorsed Hillary in late 2015, and then began to campaign on her behalf. One mistake he made fairly early on, however, was to speak about Hillary Clinton's candidacy and his support of it in his official capacity as HUD Secretary. Now, this is technically an ethics violation. It's clearly not a very big one, yet it is something you can get in trouble for. Castro got off pretty lightly. This was hardly the biggest scandal of that period, and his solution to cover up what he had done and to try to show his how sorry he was that all this had happened, what he did was to require his staff to learn more about the Hatch Act that he had violated. So, in other words, he was the one who had made the mistake, but it was his staff that would have to do extra work because of his mistake. So, seems pretty fair to me. In early 2016, in order to test out Castro's electability and his chemistry with Hillary as a running mate, he appeared with her in Iowa and New Hampshire, and apparently he must have come up short because, as you're all aware, Hillary Clinton went on to pick Tim Kaine, who is the human equivalent of saltine crackers, to be her running mate in 2016. Kaine ended up bringing nothing to the ticket, but perhaps Hillary thought that Castro would bring even less. Going into the 2020 cycle, Julian Castro decided to forget about being VP and go for the top slot. He wanted to become the nation's first Hispanic president, and if he had been elected, he would have also been, I believe, the 5th youngest man to ever hold the office. On January 12, 2019, nearly a full year before the release of this video and the end of his campaign, Castro launched his campaign, emphasizing 3 important issues. He supported Medicare for all. He supported universal pre-K. This is something he could really build on, since this is something he'd actually worked on as mayor. And he also wanted to push for comprehensive immigration reform, which would include creating a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. All of these are issues that would resonate with the Democratic base, so they were pretty well chosen. And given that he was the only Hispanic candidate in the race, that he was on the younger side, that he had some Obama nostalgia on his side, it wasn't unreasonable to think that he might have a shot. Now, in any field that ends up swelling up to about 27 candidates, no one has a clear path, but this is not an unreasonable strategy. Unfortunately for Julian Castro, his strategy was not matched by his execution of that strategy. Castro's early execution of his strategy was comically terrible. He was clearly and painfully trying his damnedest to be the Latino Obama. In his announcement video, Castro looks deeply uncomfortable, and he tries to lower his voice below where it normally is to sound like Obama. He also tries to mimic Obama's mannerisms in a way that looks like a really bad SNL skit. Say if SNL decided to stop trying to be funny and just started trying to do serious impressions, but also with the same kind of B-rate acting. That's what the whole thing looked like. The delivery was stilted, and it was just plain awful. His appeal, or at least what he wanted his appeal to be, is that he wanted to be a young underdog who had leadership experience and ability, and who was the antithesis of Donald Trump, and someone who also had a great immigrant family story to contrast with Trump's xenophobia. The problem, of course, is that as we've seen by a deep look at Castro's resume, the fact is his resume doesn't include very much leadership. When he had the chance to lead as HUD secretary, he didn't really do much until it became politically advantageous. When he was mayor of San Antonio, his job was cutting ribbons and dyeing his hair blonde as part of a bet with a local high school sports team. So he doesn't really have that much leadership experience to talk about. The only thing he really has is being young and having a good immigrant family story. And that is not a very compelling basis for a campaign. I guess also he's friends with Obama, but as we now know, Obama does not have any interest in supporting any candidate who would back a Medicare for all system, which would invalidate his Obamacare legislation. Ever since Julian Castro failed to qualify for the December debate, one of the common narratives that I've seen on both the left and in more centrist news outlets is that it's a real shame that Castro, who's brought so much to this race, hasn't been given more time on stage. The same has been said of Cory Booker, and the thought is that the two of them are bringing so much to the table intellectually that it's a real shame that we're deprived of their voices. In the case of Booker, he's brought literally nothing to the table. When it comes to Castro, he has brought some stuff to the table, but it gets massively overplayed. The media bends over backwards to try to talk about how great it is that there is a Hispanic candidate, when in fact, if Castro really was as impactful as some of his defenders say that he is, that would have surely been reflected in the polls at some point. Yes, I'm saying that Castro was overrated. And if you really think about it, after the smoke clears, you'll see that I'm right. Julian Castro has not had a major impact on this race, but he has brought a couple of issues to the fore. In one debate, Castro effectively bullied Beto O'Rourke and some other people into accepting his position on providing a path to citizenship for the undocumented and reclassifying illegal border crossing as a civil offense. He made a pretty good case there, but ultimately he used bullying tactics. And I actually kind of like that, because one thing you look for in a leader is the ability to know what tactics to choose. And if you are running for something like the president, you have to know that the bully pulpit is one of your most effective tools. So Castro at least understands the job of a president, so he has to get some credit for that. And I think that he did successfully shift the opinions of a whole lot of people in the field. Unfortunately, one of the major candidates who he wants to influence is Joe Biden, and there's no way he's going to change Joe Biden's mind about anything. Ever since his time as mayor of San Antonio, Castro has been a strong proponent of the LGBTQ community. He held pride parades and did some other stuff. And one thing that he's been at the cutting edge of lately is being very outspoken on transgender issues. The transgender community tends to be the neglected part of the LGBTQ acronym, and for the most part they don't have a whole lot of defenders, but Julian Castro has really taken it upon himself to talk about their issues at length. He tweeted that the military should allow transgendered people to serve. The only problem with that is that if someone's going through gender transition and they're taking a lot of hormones, they might not be healthy enough to serve in the military, since it's very physically demanding. But otherwise, he makes a valid point that anyone should be allowed to serve, especially now that the Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation has been repealed. So, not an unreasonable position, and one that very few people have taken. Castro has also garnered attention for discussing policing minority communities, and doing so in a much more detailed way than most of the other candidates. Beyond this, however, Castro has not really said anything that's garnered all that much attention. He hasn't really changed the discourse in any real way. That's not to say that this is his whole campaign, however. Castro, to his credit, has actually run a very substantive campaign. So let's look at some of the other issues that Castro has advocated, albeit with less fanfare than the major issues that I've outlined here. Let's take a look at some of Julian Castro's lesser-known stances. If we just look at his platform without considering his background or looking too deep into the details, then superficially he does appear to be one of the most progressive candidates in the entire field. He opposes taking PAC money, and I don't think he took any as a candidate. I might be mistaken on that. He does have a policy platform proposal for really limiting the role of money in politics. However, that plan doesn't actually include getting money out of politics. He talks about repealing Citizens United. The problem is Citizens United is just steroids for an existing problem. Getting rid of Citizens United does not actually cure the ill of having moneyed interest running Washington. So his plan is effectively what Hillary Clinton was pushing in 2016. He just phrases it better. And by not taking PAC money himself, he seems to be more virtuous on the issue. He does call for stronger environmental policies than most of the candidates, but he also makes sure to provide provisions to protect fossil fuel jobs. This policy seems fairly well crafted in terms of meeting the needs of most Democratic voters to protect the environment and balancing that out with the economic needs of people who work in the oil and gas industries. If anything, it reminds me a lot of the kinds of details that I recall when I was researching Jay Inslee. Castro has very specific deadlines for eliminating, say, carbon emissions or whatever. Some of those deadlines are in the 2030s, some are in the 2040s, 2050s. It's a very detailed plan, but it's nothing terribly inspiring, and once again, that reminds me of Jay Inslee. One of Castro's major planks is to combat white nationalism and domestic hate by reallocating some of the FBI's resources to investigating domestic terrorist and white nationalist groups. This is something that the FBI tends to under-investigate, so that's not necessarily a bad plank, but I think he's trying to link it in very heavily with social media in the sense of trying to say that the rhetoric of someone like Trump and then the spread of, I guess, right-wing stuff online causes domestic hatred and violence. That's a link that I think would be pretty damn hard to prove. And I think that this stance would probably turn off a lot of voters in a general, even if this does very much fly in a Democratic primary. One thing that he has going for him, which I found very surprising, is that Castro actually has a very strong stance on labor. He wants to strengthen labor by democratizing workplaces. This means putting workers on corporate boards, letting workers have more say in determining their own hours. He wants to ensure a universal right to unionize. That would be huge. And he also wants to allow for sectoral bargaining, something that is currently forbidden under National Labor Relations Board standards. Sectoral bargaining would be workers across an entire industry could negotiate together regardless of what company they work for. If such things were to be implemented, and Warren and Bernie both have similar things in their own platforms, that would be a massive step forward for American labor, and this would really ensure that wages and benefits would remain strong and become stronger both in the directly affected fields and then fields competing for manpower. So of all the things in Castro's platform, this is actually, I think, the most impressive, and it's really kind of a shame that he didn't push this more explicitly. Otherwise, he probably would have done quite a bit better, since this really is a great issue to be advocating. Another thing that he's doing that I think is important, it's something that we should really be hearing more about, is that he's calling for eliminating lead poisoning across America. Now, Flint is the most famous example of lead poisoning in the country, but it is hardly the only city that has this problem. There are other cities, many of which are majority-minority, which have this problem. Mostly all these places are full of poor people. And lead is something which, if it's in your water, it causes illness, and it can really screw up a community. This is something that can also be fairly easily and cheaply fixed in the grand scheme of things, and the fact that we're not doing more about it is a national disgrace. So, again, Castro deserves some credit for his stances, but a lot of what he's talking about, it's hard to really pinpoint anything that's truly unique to Julian Castro. Most of what I just laid out for you, at least the things that would be really productive, have already been covered by other candidates. We're talking about stronger environmental protections. Well, Bernie has all that in his Green New Deal. We're talking about getting PAC money out of politics. Well, Bernie Sanders has an even better version of that plan. He wants to strengthen labor by democratizing workplaces, etc. Both Bernie and Warren talk about that. And he wants to eliminate lead poisoning in America. Well, so does Bernie Sanders. Castro is effectively trying to compete for space with Bernie, but he has way less credibility on all of these issues, and he doesn't go as far. So it's no surprise that he's not getting all that much traction for the stances that he has when someone else has better versions of those stances and way more personal credibility on being able to get those things done and on consistently advocating for all of those things over decades. Castro deserves credit for running a substantive campaign and raising some good things in his platform. Unfortunately, for anyone looking for, say, a progressive alternative to Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, if you actually go into Castro's record, you're not going to come away very impressed. On the one hand, he doesn't have very much experience doing much policy-wise, and on the other hand, when he did have authority, he dragged his feet as much as possible in order to avoid doing the right thing. This would suggest to any reasonable person that Julian Castro is not nearly so far left as his platform might suggest. While going left on labor issues is a great move electorally, this is something that will really strengthen the Democratic Party. It's something that will rally a large portion of the base. It will turn out people who normally don't vote, win independents, and maybe even some moderate Republicans. This is something that ensures that if you are relying upon the DNC and the establishment for your support, that they are not going to favor you. Castro's whole career up to this point has been heavily, if not entirely, predicated upon being subsidized by the DNC. He was a young minority with a good story, and that is what they're looking for in candidates, looking for someone who was willing to play ball with the party and who is diverse. Castro meets those requirements, and therefore he was artificially boosted beyond his actual political abilities. The party was looking for someone who could rise up and take the mantle of leadership from Joe Biden. The reason they're backing Biden is because he's got great name recognition and he does okay in head-to-head polls against Trump. However, it can't really be much of a secret that the party establishment was secretly hoping that Harris, Booker, Gillibrand, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, or whoever would rise up, gain a bunch of popularity, and be the next big thing, the next Obama, and therefore allow Joe to retire before his dementia embarrasses everyone. Castro could have been in the running as one of the establishment favorites, one of the people that CNN would feel compelled to run segments about. But what about this guy? Isn't he great? But he wasn't, and the reason is because he tried to run as a progressive and compete for space with Bernie Sanders and people like Elizabeth Warren. And guess what? He's not able to do that because he doesn't have the track record, and he doesn't come across as the real deal. Early on, he also made a key mistake. First impressions can be lasting impressions, and while Castro was known to some political junkies and residents of San Antonio, the fact is that most Americans, even people who follow politics pretty closely, don't really keep close track of who the HUD secretary is. My first introduction ever to Julian Castro, beyond just hearing the general news about the Castro brothers, was seeing him give his announcement speech. That was the incredibly stilted, cringy Obama impression. And once I saw that, I realized that this guy has zero charisma and that there's no reason for him to be in this race because he has no chance. Later, Julian became more aggressive and adopted more of a pugilistic style. He went after people like Beto O'Rourke, and he landed some solid blows. He looked somewhat commanding on the stage. He had a good grasp of policy. The problem is that while this made him seem strong, it did not make him seem appealing in any way. Castro seemed unpleasant. He did not seem all that likable. He seemed a lot more like someone like John Delaney than like someone who can get up and make a case and get people behind him. So, if anything, I'd have to say that as much as Amy Klobuchar lacks appeal, she is much more likable as an attacker than Julian Castro. Castro is able to eviscerate someone without giving himself anything. And this failure to find a successful style, combined with his previous choices leading into this campaign, means that Castro never really had a path. Once he chose his path, he conducted his campaign relatively well once he abandoned that terrible Obama impression. But the fact is that his campaign was doomed from the start. He was not in a position to run for president when he announced. Some of my friends have expressed that they really respect Julian Castro, and that if he were doing better in the polls, they might support him rather than Bernie or Warren. I really have no idea where they're coming from, and I suspect that they haven't looked deeply enough into Julian Castro's background. If we really think about who Julian Castro is and look at his associations and the people who he names as his political heroes, it's extraordinarily clear that Julian Castro is an establishment neoliberal who is selectively left on certain issues. In this way, I am glad that I chose to do Inslee and Castro on consecutive days, since this applies to both of them in equal measure, but in regard to different issues. When it comes to social issues, Julian Castro is very much as far left as you can get without being completely and totally unviable. When it comes to other things, however, Castro has not shown nearly the level of commitment. When I really have to think about why he labels himself as a progressive and why he tries to position himself as far left as possible on a number of issues, when that's clearly not his actual political brand, it strikes me that Castro is trying to be what he thinks people expect him to be. Because he's young and he's non-white, he thinks that people expect him to be progressive and bold, so those are the policy positions that he tries to stake out. However, if that is really Castro's politics, if he really is a swashbuckling leftist, then why is one of his greatest political heroes Bill Clinton? Bill Clinton took the Democratic Party to the right. Bill Clinton made the party fully neoliberal. The party under Bill Clinton completely caved to the Republicans on major priorities and all economic issues. If Castro really is a progressive in any meaningful sense, i.e. if he's serious about what he said about labor in his platform, then it makes absolutely no sense for him to be a devotee of Bill Clinton. When we look at who has supported Julian Castro and who has tried to promote his career, we see that he served as an intern for Bill Clinton, and then he was actively courted by Obama, who sought him out not once but twice to join his administration, and then by Hillary, who really wanted to pick him as VP until she saw how terrible he was on the campaign trail. Again, we also have to keep in mind that the vision of the Democratic establishment for quite a while now has been to find young and diverse candidates who carry the neoliberal line. People who won't rock the boat, who are willing to go along to get along, and who simply appear to be different. They want to replace white candidates with palette swaps of people who are identical to those candidates ideologically. That is the goal of establishment leaders like Neera Tanden, Rahm Emanuel, W. Wasserman Schultz, all the usual suspects. And Julian Castro must fit the bill if he's being courted this aggressively while having demonstrated very little in the way of accomplishment up to this point in his life. Similar in a way to Jay Inslee, Julian Castro's career is more or less future-proof. He finds himself in an ideal situation regardless of what happens with the party. Still only 45 years old, Latino, friendly with the powers that be, espousing ideas in line with the expectations of his party's base, and as a native of a state, Texas, which is rapidly turning purple, Castro should have a long political future ahead of him. So while he has some severe shortcomings in the charisma department, the fact is that he gained quite a bit of attention and name recognition from his run for president, and he is in a state which seems to be quite open to his political aspirations, especially as we move forward and the state continues to trend more blue. Castro has also been making great strides in terms of improving his presentation over the course of the campaign, but there's still some work to do. I think at this point he must know for certain that he is not Obama and that he should not try to be Obama. He should go with his natural personality and not fake it. That is the secret to being charismatic, is being natural. We're in an era of keeping it real, not an era of doing really bad impressions and trying to use cadences that suit other people's voices. However, because Castro just doesn't have that much charisma and there's not all that much you can do about it, sure, you can be yourself, but it can only get you so far depending on what you have to work with. I think that Castro's ceiling is most likely as either governor of Texas or one of the state's 2 senators. I don't think he has presidential level charisma. It just isn't there. However, there could potentially be a President Castro in the future if Joaquin wanted to run. Now, I don't think Joaquin is anything like a shoo-in, but if we think about the differences between the 2 brothers, there are a couple subtle differences which make me think that Joaquin has a much better shot at the White House than Julian. Joaquin is the more outgoing of the 2 brothers. That is to say that he is the more natural politician of the 2. Now, Julian is more of a policy guy. He studies harder and he is more up to snuff on policy, but the fact is that Joaquin has been more politically successful. He's been holding down a House seat for some years at this point, and he is a more natural politician, which means that if he were running, he would be much better at retail politics and making connections with voters. And I doubt that he's all that different from his brother, so if he has all the same advantages his brother has, and the 2 of them are competing head-to-head for office, I can't help but think that Joaquin would get the nod over Julian. People prefer someone they can relate to, after all. So, Julian Castro's prospects are pretty good, but his brother Joaquin, I would argue, has even better prospects going forward. There's a very good chance that regardless of who wins the nomination, assuming that person goes on to win the general, that Julian Castro could find his way back into a presidential administration. There are a number of posts he could be put at, and since he tends to be vastly overestimated by all of officialdom, I could easily imagine him being put in the positions for which he has no prior experience or training, and no one would question it. At any rate, we won't know much about Castro's future until this primary is resolved. Until then, and as always, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will catch you next time. Over the next 2 days, I plan on releasing 2 more videos and finally finishing up all of the 2020 Democratic candidates once and for all.